So, welcome everyone to the keynote address for the Hack MedTech final event. We're honored to have Richard Jonkers with us, PhD. He is a principal clinical research specialist in both the endovascular and diabetes divisions at Medtronic Canada. So we're very honored to have him with us today. First, a quick note about the MedTech Talent Accelerator. So this is an NSERC Create funded program. It's a joint program between McGill and Ryerson University. The program prepares graduate students for careers in the medtech industry. We train students with industry-focused courses and innovation seminars like today before placing them in internships in the medtech industry. Richard is kindly presenting as part of the innovation seminar component of the program, and also as part of the hackathon component of the program, where students in internships participate in a hackathon to solve an industry challenge. So without further ado, I'll let Richard take control and give his seminar. So thank you very much. Let's have a virtual round of applause for Richard Jonkers.
Thanks, Jesse. I was actually kind of missing this. That's missing with a virtual component of these kind of seminars and hackathons. That after the really nice pitches that we saw today, that we don't really hear the applause, because I really loved the creativity in the solutions for carb counting. And I will already apologize if you will see my cats running through the screen. Because they, for some reason, always find it very interesting to be part of these kind of presentations. I've been asked to share my perspectives on what it is to, or how it is to move from academia to industry. So I will be focusing more on my personal journey, actually, how I enjoyed or experienced moving from a pretty heavy academic career, if you will, to working for industry. So from, depending on who you ask, I suppose, from one dark side to another dark side. And near the end, I will show a little bit of how we look at innovation, very small, very short on innovation with Medtronic. And I think there will be ample time to discuss and to answer some questions that you guys may have. So from academia to industry, for me that means from studying biomedical engineering to working for the medical device company Medtronic, or now we like to call us a healthcare company. So a little bit about my background first, if the slides will progress. A little bit of my background first. You may have heard something in my accent, but I grew up in the Netherlands, which is in Europe. You can see it here, lovely little country, close to Germany and Belgium, and relatively close to the United Kingdom as well. Within the Netherlands, which you see here, I grew up actually in this circle. So in the area of Tilburg is a small, very tiny city in the south of the Netherlands. And actually I grew up in a little suburb called Goorlen. And my studies mostly I was doing in Eindhoven. I lived in Goorlen with my parents and with a younger brother. And absolutely, we do have beautiful windmills near where I grew up. This one is actually, I think, about 50 meters from my parental house. So this may or may not have had a few filters, but at least you have a visual on how those windmills look like. So moving forward to Eindhoven, where I studied biomedical engineering, great vision, biomedical engineering, where engineers improve healthcare. So I was always a little bit of a nerd, if you will, with keen on physics, biology, and math, and this was really nicely combined in biomedical engineering. But what I really wanted to do is basically develop the new Ironman. Unfortunately, reality is not quite like that, but I like to think we're getting closer and closer in helping patients with definitely also with chronic illnesses, but with pretty decent solutions with very limited side effects. To focus a little bit more on my master's degree, so let's fast forward through university. There are maybe many interesting stories, but not for this occasion. So during my master's, I focused on the effects of physical activity, the physical activity status on specific skeletal muscle characteristics. So you can think about the qualities. Here you see an Olympic athlete, actually a Paralympic athlete, Jiske Grufjord, who was participating in our studies, where we looked at what is the insulin sensitivity in this case of her arm muscle, whole body level, but also in her leg muscle. And that was very interesting to see the differences of a denervated muscle type compared with a very extremely active skeletal muscle in her upper arms. And let's say the short version is that the upper arm, the fact that those muscles are so well developed, more or less compensated for whole body insulin sensitivity, and that was severely lacking in their leg muscle. But the other model that we also were comparing with was the extremely lean and muscular bodybuilders. So they were also in the study as one of the controls as well. So very fascinating study, clinical trials that I did during my master's degree. And I used different technologies or different techniques as well to measure those lipid levels. So for instance, proton spectroscopy is one of those techniques. A very highly technical, a different application than what you normally would see with magnetic resonance imaging or MRI, what you probably know from the clinic. And this was for those that are familiar with MRI with a 1.5 Tesla scanner. But then instead of an image, the image was of secondary importance. We looked at the molecular combinations. So in this case, we could see the difference between intramyocellular lipids, or otherwise fat in the muscle cell, or extramyocellular lipids, or let's say fat surrounding the muscle cell. Anyways, I won't go into too much detail in this case. Another technique that we used is we analyzed skeletal muscle tissue. And we were doing that by actually drawing muscle samples from the upper leg of our participants. And you can imagine that experience by itself was completely different when we looked at the wheelchair athletes with a completely denervated leg muscle and compare that with the experience with the bodybuilders is a completely different experience in many, many ways. With those muscle cells, we mainly used microscopy to actually identify the different muscle types, the amount of glycogen in the muscle cells, mitochondrial content as well. So a very interesting way of looking at muscle cells, or really inside of the muscle cells with a big magnification. But also a very significant amount of time during my master's, I spent basically in a dark room looking at a fluorescent microscope, and this was basically my view for many days, many hours a week. You can imagine, and some of you may have experience with that. I know it's a very different or very broad selection of expertises we have in the room. But if you are doing some lab work, you can appreciate you have to do everything yourself, as definitely also as a master's student, and life can be sometimes very, let's say, constrained as a master's student, definitely at the university. However, I worked with a group that was very keen on including everyone that contributed to every study, basically. So I did get a chance to be a co-author in this case and write parts of the paper, of the manuscripts published in many different journals. In the meantime, you may imagine that is relevant. I met a Canadian girl, we started dating. However, I did continue to work in the lab, to participate and to contribute to many different research studies. And I was lucky enough to actually be included on the papers, which is not per se always the case in every academic setting. And I eventually actually graduated. So I was definitely very happy, of course, with my graduation. And that's typically, and for some of you are already here, I heard someone saying someone already had an interview and could not be here today. But I was also the first time basically being at a crossroads for what to do now. At this point, I got the opportunity to continue my research, and I'm not sure if I chose for that because there was an easy solution, but I was definitely very, very interested in continuing the research that I was doing. So looking at physical activity and skeletal muscle characteristics in this case. So I did decide to continue my research, and I got the opportunity to actually go into a PhD project to become a PhD candidate. In my PhD project, I expanded my research to do preclinical research, actually. And I looked more broadly to lipid handling. I really focused on lipid handling only in models of insulin resistance and in physical activity and physical inactivity. In this case, I upgraded basically the scanner game, if you will. This is not a 1.5, but a 6.3 Tesla scanner, and I also worked briefly with a 9.4 Tesla scanner. So, and that was only with, as you can probably appreciate, with the bore size preclinical research. That was with lean rats, but also with more obese rats to look at those different models. Although I'm not per se a fan of doing preclinical research, I definitely learned a lot from it. In many different ways, also from ethical perspective as well. The good thing is in the Netherlands, we do have an animal ethical committee, which is, I think, very important and crucial for doing good research. But with these rats, we looked at diets and we looked at exercise with a treadmill. And so very interesting research. But again, with a scanner, we looked at lipid content, and this is a cross section of a rat leg, if you will, with the different muscle sections. And for instance, for the dietary research, we used carbon-13 labeled lipids, and that we could see, we could derive what proportion of the lipid content, of the intramicellar lipid content, came actually from the diet. Very interesting studies, but I won't bore you with the details later. Because in this case, then you really become the main author, the main lead of every paper, of every research that you do. That means you have to, or you write your own protocol, you write your own ethics submission, albeit an animal ethics committee in this case. You do your own stats, you do definitely your own writing, etc. So then you really realize it's not easy to just get a paper accepted in a respected peer-reviewed journal. So that's definitely one of the bigger learnings from during my PhD program. I got lucky enough to got some first author papers published as well, and yay, I did graduate actually as a PhD as well. And in the Netherlands, what is one of the nice things is that you actually get to publish your thesis in a book form with a very nice committee that you have to defend your thesis against. And in the end, which is, let's say, a difference between nerve-wracking and also very exciting, actually, because ultimately you are the expert in the room, and that's a nice feeling. At least I find it a nice feeling afterwards. But then another big question comes. So now what? So now you did finish your PhD degree. You have your degree. You studied biomedical engineering, which by itself also is that you're not per se an expert on one single thing. So it's already super broad. However, biomedical engineering is definitely, I think, a good starting point if you want to work for companies like Medtronic. So definitely a lot of thinking. Do I want to continue with a postdoctoral for a postdoctoral period, and then maybe even try to become a professor, or do I want to go to industry? So interestingly enough, I think I got very lucky actually, at least I like to think that we were on holiday and we happened to be in Hong Kong at that time, and I got approached through LinkedIn by Medtronic if I was interested in an interview with Medtronic. And I didn't even know at that time that they did have a position available. The position appeared to be a clinical research specialist, but other than indeed the job description, I definitely was not aware what that actually means. But I thought, you know what, I've experienced with preclinical studies. I have done clinical trials with as many as 30 participants, so that's pretty big. I've designed protocols, I've done the statistics, I wrote papers, so I'm pretty sure that I am a clinical research specialist, right? So I was pretty, let's say, half confident to go into this interview. But then you get all those questions like, why are you leaving academia? You have a bunch of papers published. And do you have any industry experience at all? Little did I know that there are definitely decent differences between doing a clinical trial, let's say in the university realm or in the industry space. Because when they ask, have you ever done a clinical trial? Industry is more thinking about a clinical trial with at a minimum 100 participants, and let's say up to 1,500 or 2,000 participants in the MedTech environment. And then also they need to know if you're familiar with all those acronyms like GCP, ISO, GDP, FDA, CMARC, CIP, CRF, SOP, etc. So you can imagine that your mind is pretty flustered, pretty dazzling with all those new terms, and how you come in confident and get out a little bit puzzled. Like, is that actually the same thing? Are we doing the same thing with the same end goal? I have to say, during that interview, it came to me that that also academia and industry is very similar, to be honest. There are maybe different magnitudes in the size of the trial. There are different roles, and I will show that later, what my perspective is on the difference for clinical trials, for studies, let's say on an individual level between industry and academia. But there is also a big difference in how trials are being approached. However, apparently there was something that I did do well. After a while, they decided to give me the opportunity to start working for Medtronic in the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, I started working for the endovascular therapies group. I'm not sure if you are familiar. I trust you are not familiar with the whole portfolio of Medtronic, but one of the portfolios, one of the therapies that Medtronic offers are within the endovascular therapies. And I got the opportunity to work with two main devices. So one is a thoracic stent graft, which you see on the left with the deployment, that basically is trying to treat aneurysms and dissections in the aorta, also acute and chronic aneurysms, which is definitely very, very important and saves many patients' lives. For the acute dissections, of course, that has to be treated very quickly, because otherwise bleeding is a very big challenge. Another study that I definitely was, for this study, for the lab study, I was involved with more the latter part of the research. So think about the data analysis, writing the final report, and closing out the different centers that participated with us. And in parallel, and this was all in the Netherlands still, and in parallel, I got also involved with a trial that was studying the impact admiral drug-eluting balloon or drug-coated balloon. And this is a balloon used to treat atherosclerosis and other peripheral arterial diseases. So at that time, this was pretty revolutionary. Although for those that are familiar with it, there is a little bit of controversy around this right now. I won't go into detail with that at the moment, but what was interesting participating or being part of the team for this particular trial is that I was part of the startup of the study. So with let's say the left product with the stent graft, I was part of the tail end of the study, of wrapping up the study. And with the drug-coated balloon, I was really part with the startup of the study. So since we are now talking a little bit more, or we are now going to talk a little bit more about Medtronic, I changed the formatting also to the Medtronic slides. And I want to share with you how I interpret the role as a clinical research specialist. So as a clinical research specialist, don't forget everything that you did and you're responsible for in academia. But the clinical research specialist with industry, you are more moving towards the program manager than actually performing the study, let's say, by yourself. So you need many different building blocks actually to come with a final study result of the highest quality. So you have to think about budget. You have to think about with what clinics, what hospitals you want to collaborate with, what key opinion leaders, with what experts in the field, which great researchers. You have to create lots of documentation actually to make sure that a study is being run appropriately, that you collect the right amount of data, that you do not collect too much data as well, which that's also very important in terms of privacy. In Canada, think about PIPEDA, and now in Europe they have started with a GDPR NDR policy, and always keeping the patient in the center of your attention. So patient safety is at all times the highest priority for every study that you design, and in study preparation and all the way throughout the study. And if we are then focusing more on the next step, so after study preparation, really study start, you finalize, let's say, the partnerships with the different hospitals, and you collaborate with the different hospitals to do the ethics submission. And when I was working in the Netherlands, Medtronic has a relatively large office there that is responsible for the research that we do outside of the United States. So the fun part there is also that you deal with different countries, with different ethics boards, with different, slightly different rules from a regulatory perspective as well. So you get to know and you get familiar with a large set of different nuances for ethics boards. Also in terms of local compliance rules, the guidelines and the laws can be slightly different in the many different jurisdictions that I got to work in. So I was fortunate enough to actually work not only with Dutch collaborators, but also in Latin America. That includes Argentina, in Australia, Hong Kong, and at that time I was already connected to Canadian sites as well, which was for me quite convenient, as I was still dating at that time my unfortunately now ex-wife, who is Canadian. Let's move on to study execution, which you are also part of, and you play a pivotal role, actually more so in study execution. With study execution, you're really focusing on source data verification. You work with regulatory bodies like FDA, Health Canada as well, to stay within the compliance rules. You work together also with the experts in the stats department to make sure that your sample size indeed is high enough. That's also part of the preparation, but sometimes you also do an interim analysis to just make sure that you're still on the right track and that the study is still moving along appropriately. And you keep having a focus also on the safety of the patient. So you look at the adverse events. Do they not exceed what was expected? Is everything still being executed in a safe and in an appropriate and a high quality way? One of the fun parts, definitely coming from academia, for me, was working with the numbers, really looking at the outcomes, really looking at, does this therapy help the patients, and how does this therapy help the patients? And with my role in Europe, I got a chance to actually visit a couple of completely different conferences than I got the chance with my during my academic year. So Europe PCR, Link, VEITH, all European conferences, very interesting then to be part still be part of publications. But in this case, it was more a supporting role than an active role, because there were other people typically authoring the papers. Were more the collaborators that worked together with Medtronic to actually collect the data, and the clinics that actually had the patients. So a similar but different experience in this case. So after 1 year, it was about 1 year that I worked for Medtronic in the Netherlands, which was kind of a strategic head office, as I tried to explain. So that means that you are responsible for studies in multiple countries, and not just the Netherlands in this case. So a lot of different responsibilities from that perspective for only 2 studies in that case. After 1 year, we decided to move to Canada. So as a little intermezzo, although I have to say the lifestyle between the Netherlands and Canada is not so much different, I do say there are some significant differences. So if we talk about, I'm not even talking about football versus soccer, but let's say soccer, we are looking at our men's team, and you guys have a great female team. When we talk about hockey, we talk about field hockey. And definitely our ladies team is the pride of the nation. And I guess with you guys, it's also the ladies team, but also the men's team, and it is hockey on ice. And snack-wise, we have deep fried croquettes, and you guys have the amazing maple syrup. So putting that aside, moving to Medtronic Canada, I got the great opportunity to actually transition within the company. This is a picture of our head office in Brampton, in Ontario. And I got a great opportunity to work within the clinical research team in Canada as a result of a maternity leave. So I was able to cover maternity leave. So in the beginning, I was not expecting, let's say, too much of it, because in the Netherlands, that may have changed by now, but in the Netherlands, women get like 3 months, maybe 4 months off, but here it's a whole year. So I was super excited for that I got a whole year the chance to actually work for Medtronic in Canada, which was on paper, I got the same role. So I still was a clinical research specialist, but the responsibility was completely different. So instead of working for one business unit, the endovascular therapies group, I was in the first year supporting multiple business units with multiple products and multiple studies. So think about our pacemaker. It's maybe the most well-known product for Medtronic, but we also had an aortic ablation device. We had let's say, implantable loop recorder, still the drug-coated balloon, and of course, the insulin pump, which you guys are now very much more familiar with than probably, let's say, 3 weeks ago. So within Medtronic Canada, I was more or less a regional clinical specialist. So what that means is you still work in a multidisciplinary group, but instead of working with multiple countries, also in the clinical research space, I was more working with let's say, also with marketing and with education and with legal and with local regulatory as well, to get study execution done in the right way. So instead of being an expert, let's say, of 1 or 2 studies, I really got a chance to become an expert of the Canadian landscape. So of the different clinics in Canada, of the different key opinion leaders in Canada, and really focused also on the Canadian regulations, like a Tri-Council policy, Health Canada, and that kind of fun. And there's also, what I was definitely excited about, gave me the opportunity to really have face-to-face conversations with the great minds in Canada, with really the key opinion leaders. In the beginning, it was for 2 different business units mainly, and later on, I got to focus on diabetes, more and more on diabetes. But this also gave me the opportunity to learn a lot more about the legal aspect, for instance. So I was a lot more involved with agreeing on a contract with many different hospitals, and I really got to learn a lot about what is actually in the contract. So same role, but completely different learnings actually came from this. Then let's say after about, so the 1 year of maternity leave cover, there was another colleague of mine that went on maternity leave, and I swear I had nothing to do with that. But for me, there was another year, an opportunity to work with Medtronic, and my colleague that went on maternity leave here was responsible for the diabetes portfolio. And definitely with my background, where I was studying insulin resistance in physical activity and physical inactivity, so that increased my knowledge around type 2 diabetes. And that was at the same time as when we did the Optimize trial. And the Optimize trial was, and still is actually, the largest trial for medical devices using a pump for patients living with type 2 diabetes. So there was this beautiful old pager-like pump. And I got to work with, unfortunately, it's with a professional CGM system that we are discontinuing, unfortunately, and our software, the Careling software. So that was the first introduction to diabetes, and this introduction after, I would say after 1 year, or probably about 1 year as well, changed my role more or less into a clinical affairs and research specialist. So what I mean with that is clinical affairs is you increase and intensify the collaboration with external stakeholders. So not only with the key opinion leaders in terms of physicians, but also with very smart and great researchers like Dr. Haidar, for instance. And this allowed me to get more involved with our strategies around marketing, around reimbursement, our regulatory strategies as well, to getting our, let's say, newest pump, for instance, I heard it earlier today, the 670G, as fast as possible to market. And I still got the chance to visit the different conferences, and instead of only learning during those conferences, I really got the chance to discuss different types of research, different strategies for research, different research ideas, and basically around the globe, which is super exciting as well. So not only conferences in Canada, like IDF, and that was in Vancouver a couple of years ago, also going to the States for ADA, and I got a chance also to go to Europe for the diabetes technology conference. So you can imagine that my role has changed gradually over the years. And that's, I think, one of the exciting things as well to work for industry is I feel you're less, quote unquote, stuck into one position and one role. You really get a chance to explore different roles that are important to ultimately provide the patient access to the newest technology that means the most actually for ultimately that individual patient. And to give you a little flavor of how that looks like on a high level with diabetes, I want to show you the next two slides, how that innovation works with Medtronic. So you now know that the multiple daily injections, where you already need to be able to do the carb counting, is super important, and that's actually how this hackathon probably also started. Is a great solution for patients, or great solutions. Research actually has shown that intensive insulin infusion is crucial to maintain, let's say, appropriate or acceptable glucose levels. However, with multiple daily injections, although the insulins, the pharma does get better, that's still very, very challenging. And diabetes is an uphill battle, as I'm sure some of you experienced that themselves, but have found that also through the research. So with Medtronic, we introduced an SAP platform, or a sensor augmented pump platform. And this is already many years ago, where we combined the glucose sensing with the insulin delivery device, if you will. And in this case, it was only informative and to give alerts and alarms, so the patient has to interact themselves. Next innovation, a small step, is to actually have to actually apply and allow an immediate reaction to a sensor reading. So in this case, for low glucose suspend or suspend on low, is when the sensor reading is dangerously low, that the pump automatically stops delivering insulin, which is very important and the first step in automation to reduce the risk for hypoglycemia. The next step, maybe a baby step, if you will, would be suspend before low. So suspend the insulin delivery before you actually reach that low threshold. So a little bit more automation comes in this, because instead of only looking at the sensor value, you're actually looking at also at the rate of change, so that you use prediction basically already a little bit in this technology. Now, where we are today is a hybrid closed loop system, which is the 670 system, the MiniMed 670 system, and that is a system that is a hybrid system. So it is a hybrid system, still is a hybrid system. So if one of your inventions will be successful, it will be definitely a lot less hybrid, because then the meal announcements, the carb announcements, hopefully can go away at some point, which will definitely decrease the burden of living with diabetes or the burden of pump technology significantly. If we then look at a timeline, how this looks like, so the first pump system was already launched at 2003. And by 2010, there was already an integrated system, so a pump system with a glucose sensor. So that's already a decade ago now. So you can also appreciate that, and I saw some timelines of how you want to implement technology and commercialize it. And I do feel there were some ambitious plans, but you were getting there with a 5-year time frame to be, that's closer to reality than inventing something and deploying it basically within a year. The first automation started in 2010 till about 2016, where we introduced a new platform. But this was really the automation of insulin suspension here. And then today, this was by 2018, we launched the MiniMed 670, which didn't automatically suspend the insulin delivery, but actually automated the insulin delivery itself. And in the near future and the further future, we need connectivity, of course, with a smartphone, and ultimately we want to advance also our closed loop systems so that carb counting will be less and less of a burden. For instance, by introducing automated correction boluses. So that means that when the sensor glucose reading is going up really quickly, that the system can automatically not only provide a micro bolus, but also a much significantly larger bolus to actually mitigate that increasing glucose control. And ultimately, we want to move towards a personalized closed loop system. That hopefully, and maybe with one of the inventions or that you guys bring to market, and I heard some people wanted to collaborate with Medtronic, and who knows, that may be possible in the future to really automate meal control first in a personalized closed loop system. So in summary, how I see the differences between, if we look at a clinical trial or at studies, if you will, because we also do preclinical research, is between academia and industry. So typically in academia, overall, I find the research is very fundamental, which is definitely very crucial, but it's definitely more fundamental, where industry, ultimately, products need to be sold. So it is a lot more applied, the type of research, definitely that I was involved with. Who is responsible for the study design? Academia, it's mostly, in my experience, a PhD student, somewhat together with the professor. In industry, we're really looking at the clinical research specialist, the quality manager, your own manager, the regulatory body, R&D. I forgot a couple here, but there are many, many people involved with study design. Sample size, my experience was let's say 8 was the bare minimum to actually do a study in academia. For me, it went up to 50. I think if you can include more patients, and it's probably more epidemiological studies, but when you actually have an intervention, 50 I would think that's a decent size. Where in industry, other than really feasibility studies, the pivotal studies do not have less participants than 100, and they go. The largest study that I was involved with had 1,500 enrollments. Study starts. There's no one else responsible than the student in academia. In my experience, with industry, legal, regulatory, the clinical research specialist, and even sometimes the commercial division is also involved with that. Execution, academia, the PhD student or the student. Industry, we have people also to do the source data verification. We have people to do the filing. The clinical research specialist is involved basically with everything, but there are multiple people involved also in industry. Data analysis, in my experience, it was pretty much the PhD student, the student who was responsible for the data analysis, whether that was in the lab or for doing the statistics. Sometimes you got lucky, there was a technician available, but mostly you do it yourself. Where in industry, you have the statistician, you have an external lab to do those lab analysis or to do image analysis, and you are involved as well as a facilitator most often as a clinical research specialist. The report, almost the same story. The student is responsible for the final report itself, together potentially with a professor. In industry, you often have a medical writer, final report. You also have a big portion of doing that yourself. And the manuscript, which I did not add here, can be together also with one of the let's say, key opinion leaders that participated in the study. Presenting the results, in academia, it's the student again who is responsible for that. In industry, it's often the physician who presents the results. But it could also be the statistician, and in some rare occasions, it may be yourself who is responsible for that. And that brings me to the end of what I wanted to share with you. Hopefully it was somewhat helpful for you to understand at least my view at the differences between academia and industry. So I'm happy to take any questions, or I will give it back to Jesse to coordinate this part of the presentation.
Thank you, Richard, so much. That was really excellent. So we will open it up to Q&A at this point. We have quite a few participants. So maybe please just either raise your hand through the chat and you could speak, or write your question directly in the chat box. Maybe I'll kick things off on my end. So one thing I was curious about, how you were hired by Medtronic. So essentially you were handpicked, which I would argue is, atypical for getting your first job. I think most people kind of have to pound the pavement and deal with a bit of rejection until securing their first job. So I'm just curious how that came to be for you on both sides. So who was the key decision maker at Medtronic, and kind of how did you stand out to attract that attention?
That's a very good question. So I did rush over that a little bit. I did get headhunted in the beginning through LinkedIn, and I also had a couple of other. I had 2 other meetings with different companies that for different roles that did not hire me. Medtronic didn't hire me the very first time because they thought that particular role was not a fit. And it did take ultimately about 8 to 12 months before they actually hired me. I saw a interesting message there. Before they actually hired me. So it was definitely, the waiting game was very important there. But I had a very good feeling with Medtronic from the beginning. And basically my first interview was almost more an informational interview where I did not have any expectations immediately, because it wasn't per se for a role at Medtronic. And with the HR specialist, there was no expectations from her side either. So it was really an exchange of information. And then later they came back to me that they said, "Oh, we have a very interesting role that we think would be a great fit for you." And at that time, I got the opportunity to officially then again apply for that role, and I had interviews, I think, with 3 or 4 of the team members. And you have to be lucky sometimes as well that you have the right match with the right person, and the right connection with the right person, and that they are actually looking for, let's say, for someone with your background. And sometimes you have to be a match and a fit within the team as well, because that's what I know now. Because now I'm also involved with the hiring process in our team. So I definitely learn a lot how that comes around. So what I know now is that LinkedIn is still not per se a primary resource, but definitely a high priority resource for scouting and headhunting potential candidates for a role. So one of the two recommendations that I would have is, one, make sure that your LinkedIn account is up to date and is attractive for the role that you want to go for. My second recommendation is in line with that. Try to have, let's say, informational interviews with different companies, and so that you really get a flavor of what that company stands for. Does that resonate with you? Would you like to work for that company? Do you feel comfortable? Could you see working there? So that it works two ways, because the company can already meet you, and they can already assess if you are, let's say for our case, Medtronic material. And they have seen your face already. So when you then come back for a real interview, then you already have a head start, basically. So that's definitely a very big recommendation. And don't hesitate to just reach out to people within your network that already work for a company that you are interested in working with, and just have a informal chat to better understand how the company operates. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
Sure, that's great.
And answers your question.
Okay. So we do have some questions in the chat. Some people are messaging me privately. And we also have questions that came in from, the original sign-up form for this seminar. So one question is just, I think is interesting. What does your day-to-day look like? Pretty open-ended question.
Well, I get out of bed, I walk to my computer. Joking aside, it is, for me now, is super, super dynamic. The majority of my time I now focus on diabetes, but it literally means, so now I'm mentoring also a new hire in our team. So I start today typically with a, let's say, 15-minute quick chat on how she's doing, what she's up to, and if she has any questions, and just getting the day started with a cup of coffee. Since it is for diabetes, it's quite the conference season. So I work also with head office, that I'm reviewing all our abstracts that we are submitting to conferences, all our posters that we are submitting to conferences. So I'm doing a lot of review work as well, and that depends on when it is, but I'm very much involved with that right now. And then it could be that, let's say, by noon, then I've had probably a couple of conversations with some colleagues in Europe as well, because of the time difference. And then afternoon, I probably will first have a couple of looks at how the studies are progressing, let's say the studies that Medtronic is sponsoring. And then by the time it's getting later in the afternoon, then I have a couple of meetings. Could be with head office, which is in California. So there's a 3-hour time difference, or with colleagues in Vancouver, Calgary as well. And because I'm now more and more working as a medical science advisor, I tend to answer questions, also technical questions, and closer to medical related questions as well, that are where let's say our MiniMed 670 insulin pump is involved with. Other days, I work closer, for instance, with our reimbursement team to try hard to get the continuous glucose monitor actually accessible to as many patients as possible. So I love that some groups actually paid attention to the component to get their invention reimbursed. So that is very well thought of, and in 7 minutes, it looks as if you think it's easy peasy, but that's definitely a very hard battle, in particular for medical devices. So I provide more or less as an internal and external consultant information on the science behind our product, the clinical evidence that we have on our products. So yeah, I can keep talking. So there's no average day. So basically every day is different, and that's what I like very much about my job.
Excellent, thank you. So here's one from Larasati that was written in the group. How do you leverage skills and training that we get in academia to transition to industry? And there's another related question that we had from, beforehand from the audience. What skills particularly can you take from academia to industry? So what and how?
Yeah, no, excellent question. An answer that is absolutely not helpful probably is, I really think any skill can be used and can be translated from academia to industry. What is very important is that you learn how to explain a skill that you developed in academia, how you would apply that in an industry framework. So that's also the reason why I recommend to go for an informational interview and to ask around before you actually apply, because then you understand better how, for instance, let's say how preclinical testing work could be helpful in industry. So the way you can position that, for instance, is that you understand what is behind the clinical trial itself. What happens before you actually do a human trial, so you better understand the reason why a human trial is also very important. In terms of when you have been let's say a mentor of a student group, you can translate that experience into that you have skills to be a facilitator in a multidisciplinary team, because that's what you do as a clinical research specialist. When you have been teaching a class, let's say you've taught a couple of classes, so the skills that you get out of that is that you have, albeit a little bit, but you do have experience speaking for a larger audience. You have experience training people, so to actually provide training to other people. You know how to interact with people. You're not shy to interact with people. Those can be very important skills depending on the role with industry, but they are totally translatable as well. If you really look at, let's say, certificates, if you wanted, let's say, a clinical research specialist, if you are 100% familiar, definitely good clinical practice is something. If you have that certificate, that's a good checkbox to have. If you are familiar with ISO regulations, excellent certificate to have. Same thing if you are familiar with FDA regulations, good documentation practice. Those are standard certificates that are definitely very helpful. However, also not mandatory, if you will, because I, for instance, have none of those certificates before I started with Medtronic, but they do make you stand out, probably out of the big pool that you get. And try to not be shy in what you think you're good at, to bring that to the table, and don't be shy in trying to convince the interviewer that they need that specific skill. If that's problem solving, if that's having a very broad view on things, or being very specialist, already very much a specialist for a certain therapy. Don't be shy to show off during an interview. However, always be true. The truth is very important. So don't promise things you cannot deliver. That's absolutely crucial. I hope that helps.
I think it does. So thank you. Here's an interesting one. I think we have time for a couple more questions. So does working in industry satisfy your scientific curiosity to the extent that research did?
Yeah, well, yes. It does. It didn't maybe the first year to the same extent, and that's a very, very legit question. Because in academia, you are really working from a scientific lens, very fundamentally looking at problems and very digging into details. So you are letting go the details, definitely in the beginning. I had to let go the details in the beginning, and I had to learn to be more program manager or project manager. However, because of my scientific interest, I really dug into the details in what is so special about that thoracic stent graft. What is so special about the drug-coated balloon? So I looked at it from a mechanistic perspective. I looked at it from a pharma perspective and from a physiological perspective. And at least with my experience within Medtronic, that allowed me to also connect with the R&D team, to really connect with the people that actually developed this, that could answer the questions that I had, and that I wanted to better understand how this works. So from a scientific perspective, I think you can learn a lot, but you may not develop so much. So that was definitely in the beginning. So yes, it did satisfy after, let's say, a couple of months when I got over myself and actually was comfortable enough to ask the right people the right questions, and to actually find the right people that could answer those questions. If we fast forward to my role right now, now I let's say, have connections like literally with, for instance, the individual that developed the algorithm for the 670G auto mode system. So now I really get a chance to actually talk to them and brainstorm about maybe what improvements could we make, and really think why did we choose for that solution. And from a scientific perspective, I can answer a lot of questions that people from, let's say, with a medical background have, and how that connects with the physiological outcomes, the clinical outcomes. So that's a very long answer to say in the beginning a lot less, but for now, absolutely. Because you're at the forefront of innovation. And in my role, actually, I also talk to companies, maybe such as one of the groups that want to collaborate with Medtronic. So I do get a chance to really look at really innovative solutions and to discuss those solutions with them. So yeah, ultimately, absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think I do want to ask one more question, last question here. So this isn't really a question. Someone just wrote, I would like to discuss collaboration opportunities with Medtronic. So my question is,
Sure.
I mean, I know you collaborate already with professors at McGill, and just since this talk was announced, we've had more interest from professors, and researchers. So I'm curious, on the academia side, how can you get involved, whether it's an academia industry partnership or just transitioning to industry, and I guess specifically with Medtronic, because Medtronic is such a unique, big company. Please.
So needless to say that we do get those requests very often. And we have, ultimately, we have a dedicated team, a business development team that is evaluating every approach, every company that approaches us for collaboration. And we have a business development team basically for all the therapies that Medtronic supports. However, let's say locally, when it involves diabetes, then I will be involved with that, probably relatively in the beginning stage of that. So what do you need? Well, you definitely need a good idea, of course. That's what it starts with. Second is, you need to be able to back up your idea with study results. A company like Medtronic does not really have the time, basically, to do the research for you and to invest already, let's say from day one, because that's a little bit too risky. There would be too many candidates to invest maybe a little bit upfront. So it is important that you create your own evidence, and then you can also pitch your idea a little bit stronger when you already have some outcomes. So that's important as well. Thirdly, make sure that your invention is protected. I heard someone talking about patents. Very important as well, because a big company like Medtronic rather wants to acquire a patent, if you will, than being accused of stealing a patent. So make sure that your invention is protected as well as it can. Is there a third thing? And those are probably the three most important components. And then there are multiple ways of collaboration. So it doesn't necessarily always need to result in an acquisition. Medtronic does acquire a whole bunch of companies. I know that, but we also do invest in companies at times. And it has to. You have to know people as well to actually get into the company. But Medtronic itself is also searching and scouting the market to see who stands out, who is doing great work as well. So, and that collaboration can start with a scientific collaboration, but that can also be an approach from a commercial perspective. There are multiple ways that lead to collaboration.
Perfect, thank you. So at this point, we'll bring the seminar to a close. I want to thank you, Richard, for an excellent talk. Thank you for the audience for your questions. Let's have a final virtual round of applause.
Thank you.
You can only hear me, so that's great.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. So now at this point, as I mentioned earlier, this is the keynote address for our hackathon. We will proceed to final awards for our hackathon. We heard pitches from our teams. I'll pass it off to our collaborators at Ryerson to announce the awards. We do have people, our audience from the public, so you are welcome to stay to hear the awards. So I think at this point, I will pass it off to Camilla. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jesse, and thank you, Richard, for your keynote. Before I announce the winner for the winners for the MedTech Hackathon, I just want to say a huge thank you to all the participants. You worked extremely hard over the last 4 weeks. We know that this wasn't necessarily easy to do virtually, and we were really, really proud to see everything that came out. It was not an easy decision to make because you all did so well. So just, give yourselves a little pat on the back for how hard you worked. So on behalf of the MedTech Talent Accelerator, I'm happy to say that our third place winner is C3S. So Nona, Pranjal, Munalisha, Gabriel, and Farah for their cloud-based carb calculation system. Our our second place is, there we go, thank you. It's Carb Vision, Xavier, Taha, Ping, Yungshi, and Tianzi. Good job, guys. And last but not least, our first place winners are Diabetech with their carb peaks. So well done to everyone, to our winners and to those who didn't place. Anyone, so a huge virtual round of applause here again. And winners, you will be contacted by MedTech Talent Accelerator within the next couple of weeks to discuss how to get your prize money to you. But again, well done. Hopefully you all continue working on doing this. And thanks everyone, our judges, our mentors, all of our participants, and everyone who came to this keynote lecture for being a part of this activity. So thanks everyone.